Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Admitting everyone in as they come in. Okay, everyone should be in now. Right, okay. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome, brothers and sisters. Welcome to the continuation of the Islamic online series. We're in lockdown 3. Apologies, we didn't get anything in lockdown 2, but we're going to continue in lockdown 3, and let's hope and pray we don't have lockdown 4 with our friend Boris Johnson. Great policies and with COVID, but inshallah, du'as to everyone and safekeeping. Right, without further ado, welcome to our session today. It's going to be a book review discussion, Turkey, Egypt and Syria, a travelogue by Shibli Numani. And we're very honored and privileged to have the author of the translation, Dr. Gregory Maxwell Bruce, who works for the Institute for South Asia Studies, UC Berkeley at the US of A. And it's very kindly hosted by our friend and team colleague, Andrew Booso. Now, for security reasons, everyone, please display your full name. It is being recorded. We will be putting it up online on our YouTube channel. Just display your full name and your not your device. I will block people if they don't fall in, because we've had some Zoom bombers in the past. We just need to make sure we don't get that sort of thing anymore. We have disabled some of the features just for security purposes, but keep your phones on silent or mute. It is being recorded. As I said, if you want to get a copy of the session today, we'll send you the link. And there is a Q&A session, so don't worry. There is a Q&A session. You'll have a chance to answer questions directly to Dr. Bruce or write it down, whichever way you're happy, we can do that. So before I hand it over to Andrew, let me just quickly tell you about the book. Turkey, Egypt and Syria, as you know, it's a travelogue that vividly captures the experiences of the prominent Indian scholar Shibli Numani as he journeyed across the Ottoman Empire and Egypt around 1892. He was a professor of Arabic and Persian at the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College at Aligarh, and he had a 6-month leave from teaching to travel across the Ottoman Empire in search of rare printed works and manuscripts to use as sources for series of biographies and major figures in Islamic history. Along the way, he collected information on schools, curricula, publishers, newspapers, presenting a unique portrait of the imperial culture at a transformative moment in the history of the Middle East. Numani records sketches and anecdotes that offer rare glimpses of the intellectual networks, religious festivals, everyday life in the Ottoman Empire and Egypt. First published in 1894, the travelogue has since been a classic of those in Urdu travel writing and immensely influential in the intellectual and political history of South Asia. Right, so this translation is the first into English with contemporary reviews of the travelogue, letters written by the author during his travels, and serialized newspapers, reports of the journey, and it's deeply enriched for the readers and students as well. So hopefully we're going to hear more from Dr. Bruce. But Dr. Bruce, for those who don't know, lectures in Urdu languages and literature at the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, holds a PhD in Asian cultures and languages from the University of Texas at Austin, where he teaches Urdu medium courses and literature, mysticism, South Asian culture in the Hindu flagship program. His research interests lie the intersection of this intellectual history, religious studies, and current projects include a book-length study of the historian Shibli Numani and translations of Urdu literature as well, Urdu vocabulary acquisition textbook, and the articles for the Encyclopedia of Islam and Iranica. He writes ghazal poetry, maybe we can get a ghazal at the end, and some Farsi, and is performed at the Mushiras and other literary events in the US of A and India. There's some great reviews of the book, but I won't hold. I'm going to hand it over to our host, Andrew. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Andrew, your turn.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Many thanks to Mizan, my brother, for the invitations and making this all possible with his hard work, his himma. And also many thanks to our guest. I mean, this is truly the sort of barakah of Eminem. And I mean Mizan and Max, not Marshall Mathers, although Marshall, of course, welcome to attend. But no, I really thank Dr. Gregory Maxwell Bruce, who we call Max for short, for blessing us with his company and undertaking this academic research into Shibli Numani, this important but sadly neglected Islamic scholar. A scholar whose neglect is surprising in light of the fact that he has been mentioned in Western academia from the 1940s with Wilfred Cantwell Smith, in the 60s, Aziz Ahmed, as well as other people talking about him, such as Barbara Metcalf, Muhammad Qasim Zaman, and Jan Peter Hartung. But here we have a dedicated study of him, as well as a forthcoming dedicated study. And so we really appreciate Max undertaking this work. And just a brief word, Mizan gave a very thorough introduction to the translation that we're focusing on today. But not only is it a complete and eloquent translation, but it is helpfully annotated with informative notes, as well as a number of really helpful appendices. In particular, the letters that Shibli wrote during his travels and the biographical sketches that Max included, which, as well as a very good translators afterward. So many thanks again, Max, for being here. Max, do you mind just maybe giving people a general introduction to yourself and your scholarly background, please?
Now, there we go. Okay, good. There's some issues with so working out the permissions and things. Thank you very much, Mizan Sahab. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction and your kind words about the translation and the annotations and everything. As Mizan mentioned, I teach Urdu language and literature at the University of California at Berkeley, and that includes courses sort of on basic things like Alif Bay, the script, but it also includes courses on Urdu literature, and I also teach a seminar in Persian literature through the Institute for South Asia Studies at Berkeley. A little bit about me, my background. I studied Hindi and Arabic first, got a fellowship to study Urdu in Lucknow in India just after my undergraduate years. Moved to India for several years, lived there, focusing on Urdu, and eventually went to graduate school with the intention of working on poetry and sort of imaginative literature. And in the course of my studies in graduate school, came to this project on Shibli Numani. And so the book, the translation, Turkey, Egypt, Syria, Travelogue, really sort of, I've sort of said to Andrew and Mizan a few moments ago, sort of inverts the typical order in which a lot of people trained in the academy think about their first book projects. Typically, we take our dissertations, turn those into our first monographs, and then think of a kind of second book project that's related to that book project. And that, of course, was what I intended to do with my intellectual biography of Shibli, which is what I'm working on these days. But instead of doing that, because I found myself in a lecturer's position and teaching a lot of literature and language, I decided to make the second book project, the translation project, my first book project. So that is how the project sort of came about. I think more substantially, when I was working on my dissertation, I kept sort of coming back to the Travelogue. And I remember reading it for the first time and thinking, what a kind of remarkable text it is. I mean, just the amount of information and the observations that he's making. And I also remember thinking that a text like this, something that, puts an Indian scholar really living at the height of the imperial period, right? The British Empire's sort of colonization of India. someone living right at the height of that imperial period, traveling to the Ottoman Empire and, connecting with scholars and meeting people like Muhammad Abdu. This must be a key text in Shibli's intellectual life. And so I started trying to draw connections between what it is he was doing in Egypt, Syria, Turkey, and where he sort of takes things later in life in terms of his career as an institution builder at Nadwatul Ulama, in terms of his intellectual projects. And I realized very quickly that he encounters all of these institutions. He's reading all of these books and talking about all of these book series in Ottoman Turkish, and he's visiting these libraries, and he's spending afternoons with various scholars. And in the course of kind of reading this, I thought, well, these scholars, these people that he's talking to must be major figures of their time. Because, I mean, how else would someone who's just kind of being introduced to, Ottoman statesmen of various kinds, Ottoman officials and things, how else would he be encountering them? And the way that they're described in the travelogue made me think that these must be sort of, these luminaries of the 1890s. And I was sort of convinced after those first few readings that that it would be fairly easy to go out into secondary scholarship in English and find discussions of the careers of these people that he's interacting with. And then it would be easy for me as a student of Shibli's ideas to begin teasing out some of those connections that I was describing. What influences did some of these scholars who are writing biographies or doing historical work or these other kinds of things that he's talking about, what influences might they have had on Shibli's intellectual life? And I very quickly discovered that that was not the case at all. That most of the people who are mentioned in the text simply haven't been studied in English. And in fact, a lot of them haven't really been studied in Arabic or, as far as I can tell, Turkish either. And I don't really read Turkish well. I taught myself a little bit for the purpose of doing some annotations and a little bit of archival research for the travelogue. But I realized very quickly that this was going to take a lot of detective work just to find out who these people are. And especially for someone like me, being a South Asianist, I know the archive fairly well for the study of intellectual history of the 19th century in South Asia, but I know nothing about sources for studying 19th century intellectuals from Damascus. I mean, I wouldn't even know where to begin. And so I began at the beginning and started spending my afternoons in the library, day in and day out, thumbing through, biographical compendia of 19th century Arabic language intellectuals from various parts of the world. And eventually, it took several years, but I eventually was able to find out who all of these people are and were that Shibli encountered in his journeys. And so the annotations in the travelogue are really the result of a long period of sort of spending some number of hours every week in the archives looking at these books and failing 98% of the, 95% of the time to find any information whatsoever on who these people are. I'll never forget when I finally discovered who Ali Zabyan or Zibyan is, depending on which sources you encounter or are reading. I almost jumped out of my chair when I found a little tiny 2-3 line bio blurb about him in some tazkira that the name of which I can't even recall now, because I'd been looking for him at that point for at least a year and a half, 2 years, and not found a thing about him. So yeah, so that's kind of how the project came about. And then, of course, the text itself being a fascinating read. I mean, there's so much in that book, ranging from a very interesting kind of almost Saidian critique of Orientalism in that opening passage. And of course, this is anticipating in some senses Edward Said's critique of Orientalism. Everything from that to really interesting perspectives on institutions that no longer exist. So, you know, firsthand accounts of small manuscript libraries in Istanbul that again don't exist anymore. Those libraries largely have been consolidated into the National Archives. And so the question of what did it look like in 1892 to walk into a very small library with, you know, 100 manuscripts or something like that of classical Arabic literature and read them? What was the process of looking at manuscripts like? What sort of facilities existed for scholars? And these are things that I think are rare to find in the literature. So that's why I decided it was important, not only for someone like me who's really interested in Shibli, but also perhaps in a book that deserved to be read by people who are interested more broadly in the history of the Middle East, the history of the Ottoman Empire. And of course, it's pretty rare to find an Ottomanist who reads Urdu. And so I thought translation would be a good way to bring out some of those stories and share those stories across sort of specializations.
No, thank you. I mean, that's our great benefit, is the fact that you did undertake that work, because rather than just say doing an academic article and just skimming over the surface, you've really unpacked the Safarnama for the readership in English. And I think that that's a great benefit for us, and especially the biographical notices. Like you said, the hard labor that you had to undertake to fill them all in, and who are all these people? I mean, so okay, it's a famous general, like the general who he met in Istanbul.
Right.
Some of the other
Osman
people,
Pasha. Yeah.
yes, would be more difficult. So that's very useful for us. What would you? I know you discussed this in your translators afterword. Out of interest, why is the afterword not an introduction?
That had to do with the publisher. It wasn't an introduction originally. The publisher said, it's too long for an introduction, cut it up, put it in at the end of the book and make it an afterword. That wasn't my decision. That was Syracuse's decision.
Yeah, sorry. It's just a geeky question I thought I'd ask as to how it ended there.
No problem.
I know you do mention its significant points in the afterword, but just for the benefit of the audience, what would you say are the significant points that are being made in the Safarnama for us to sort of take away in particular? I know you touched upon it just now, but what would you, in sort of breakdown manner?
That's a really difficult question to answer. A great question, thank you, but a really difficult one to answer. I mean, so there is, on the one hand, the points that Shibli thinks are really important, right? The thesis of the travelogue from Shibli's perspective, if I had to pick one, I mean, there's a number of intersecting ideas and sort of threads that he's weaving together, but I would argue that the kind of central thesis of the travelogue is that Arabic language education is in need of reform, that the situation, and this is something he repeats several times in the travelogue, the sort of state of Arabic education and the state of Islamic education, which are of course overlapping, in the Ottoman Empire is really not much better than it is in India. And that this is something that disappointed him, right? He expected to go to the Ottoman Empire and discover these great institutions of Arabic Islamic education and bring back information to South Asia about them. And he doesn't find that. And what he finds is that the same kind of what he views as problems with Arabic Islamic education in South Asia are also found throughout the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East, which is that, I mean, this is sort of a very common criticism among reform-minded scholars like Shibli, people like Syed Ahmad Khan and others, is that those who are modern educated, that is to say, largely focused on a kind of Eurocentric curriculum, are out of touch with the kind of languages, literary traditions, and sciences of the kind of Arabic background that Shibli himself comes from, Arabic Islamic background that he's sort of trained in. And at the same time, the traditionalist scholars, people who are studying at places like Azhar in Egypt, are just totally out of touch with the times, right? And so it's a kind of, it's a standard binary that is sort of used by reformers to make the kind of argument that they're interested in making in texts like this. And so for Shibli, this fact that he doesn't find an institution that's really bringing these two traditions together is really the main thesis of the book. Now, he finds in the Darul Uloom in Egypt, which is of course a modern institution founded as a teaching college, or a college for teachers, I should say, a teacher's college. He finds, I should say by Ali Mubarak, that he finds that there you have a kind of hybridization that he sees as a kind of ideal for, again, for Arabic Islamic education. But in general, I think that would be the thesis of the book from his perspective, right? That there is this kind of shared disappointment, or maybe not shared disappointment, but the things that disappoint him are shared across the borders of empire. He's disappointed just as much by India as he is by the Ottoman Empire. And so that's one thing to think about. Now, you know, I find as I'm reading the book and bringing my own sort of interests to bear on the way that I engage with it, I mean, I find very different kinds of things to be major contributions of the text. So I think that introduction in which he lays out very clearly the stakes of literature and the stakes of representation, and in which he basically argues that the ways in which, you know, he's sort of mainly talking about Turks, but by extension Arabs, and by extension Muslims in general, the way that they're talked about in European literature has this soporific effect on the consciousness of really, he's imagining kind of contemporary readers who are largely engaged with European literature, people like his students at the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College in Aligarh, and getting their education there. And I say soporific effect because this is the word he uses. He calls this kind of like, he says, if I'm recalling correctly, to read European literature and not to have negative attitudes or thoughts about Turks is like taking you know, a soporific drug, khab, something that brings dreams or brings sleep. It's like taking that drug and not falling asleep, which is to say there's this kind of profoundly powerful influence that literature has on the way, on our consciousness, on the way that we perceive these kinds of communities. And that is, as I mentioned earlier, that anticipates to a great deal, to some extent, what Said says in the 1970s about the relationship between language and discourse and power. And it's remarkable that in 1894, when Shibli was writing this travelogue, that he, as a colonized subject, as someone teaching at a kind of British affiliated colonial college, is observing this process in real time and quite aware of it. That this is not something that, as Gauri Vishwanathan in her book has kind of called this sort of a mask of conquest a certain kind of Eurocentrism that gets sort of put to the colonized subject. This is not something that that is masked for Shibli. He's quite aware that this is what is happening, and so that, I think, is one remarkable thing. I also think that you know, again, that I'm someone who lives my life in details, and I think the details in the travelogue are remarkable. I think the kind of some of the humor in the travelogue is quite remarkable. There's that great scene where Shibli comes face to face with the Sultan Abdul Hamid and the whole line of sort of Ottoman statesmen and sort of you know, other dignitaries. They all sort of bow down to and bend down to kind of greet the Sultan, and Shibli's completely overwhelmed, sort of starstruck in a sense, and rather than sort of bowing his head like everyone else, is sort of standing there muttering and, you know, wishing praises on him and things like that, and mumbling and things like that. And you can just kind of imagine this, you know, very humorous scene. There's also, you know, there's also a very interesting tension in the travelogue. And here, I think, as someone who's interested in literary studies, I find that a compelling text. There's a tension between this project that we were just kind of discussing a little bit, which is Shibli's project to challenge this kind of hegemonic, totalizing discourse about Turks and Muslims, right, that he kind of lays out at the beginning of the book, to challenge that by demonstrating, you know, in a kind of, in a way that borders on caricature in a sense, you know, to show that, oh, actually Turks are so hospitable and Arabs are also so hospitable, and to kind of offer this counter narrative. And that can be, you know, something that's frustrating to a contemporary reader because it feels reductive in a sense, right? I mean, to just sort of say, well, on the one hand, you know, European literature is giving us, you know, sort of negative impressions of Turks. So I'm going to give us this, you know, very, you know, very glowing, you know, effusive description of Turkish culture and society. So, you know, Shibli sort of engages with some of that. I mean, he kind of says that he's going to do that, but actually, if you get into the details of the travelogue, it's much more satisfying than that. So, you know, he, on the one hand, sort of tells you that he wants to show you, and in the very end of the book, sort of has some anecdotes about how kind and hospitable, you know, Turks and Arabs are. But within those anecdotes, I mean, he's sharing, you know, that the, you know, this kind of cousin relative of the Mufti of Jerusalem basically swindles him, right? I mean, there's this relationship that forms. He kind of comes, you know, Shibli's living with some people who've immigrated from, mostly from Damascus, and are sort of living in Istanbul. But he's also living with someone who's tied to the family of the Mufti in Jerusalem. And these people are all kind of interacting, and one of their cousins comes and borrows some money from Shibli, and Shibli gives it to him and, you know, basically rips him off, right? And so I think by the end of the text, if you're paying close attention to what Shibli's doing, he's actually doing something that's more remarkable than simply offering a counter narrative to European essentialism, basically, right? He ends up giving us a much fuller picture of his engagements with the people that he meets than the one that you get in kind of, again, these reductive caricatures of, you know, types, right? The Turk, the Arab, right? Which he kind of is arguing against at the beginning of the book. So you asked, what are some of the arguments of the text? And again, from Shibli's perspective, it's this kind of resistance, in a sense, to a certain kind of Orientalism. But I think that the actual interventions of the text are much more numerous than that, and they're found, in my view, as someone who spent a lot of time reading and thinking about the meaning of each word, quite literally, in the text, the meaning of every single word in it. Those interventions are actually found in the details and the kind of subtle implications of the text that one has to sort of tease out, in a sense. Did I answer your question adequately?
Yes.
And that was kind of a long answer. Yeah.
No, not at all. It's interesting, his disappointment, because you wonder if that's just due to the timing of his trip, because obviously being 1892, this is 6 years before, say, someone like Rashid Rida starts Al-Manar, and it seems as though he didn't have a window, or a very accurate window, into the state of affairs until he actually arrived there. Whereas now in the modern age where we live, the internet, books, we have that interaction where you can very easily find out what's happening on the other side of the world. Whereas he really seems to be quite surprised by the fact that he goes to the lands of what he calls Islamic governance. And he finds their state of education to be as woeful, in his opinion, as it was in India.
Right.
And so as someone who's trying to reform traditional education, what he calls, ta'lim qadim, how do you think the realization that it was just as bad over there as it was in India, from his perspective, how much do you think that influenced his future efforts to reform education? Do you think we can see from his other writings that he felt that he would have to really forge his own path, and there wasn't a model or something that he could really emulate in India, but he was really going to have to be establishing something on his own terms?
Thank you for that question. Let me think about this. So I don't think it's a coincidence that Shibli is writing this book at the same time that preparations are being made to hold the first conference of Nadwatul Ulama, which happens in the fall of 1894, in 1894, just around the time that, is it fall, I think? You may know better than I.
Well, the initial meeting before Nadwa was conceived as an idea is 1892.
Right, yeah. But the first conference.
The first conference is about 1894 when they decide to actually establish it.
Right, yeah, that's 1894. I'm just trying to remember if it was in the fall I think it was in the fall of 1894, yeah? I don't think it's a coincidence. So Shibli's been in conversation with people who are thinking about ways to reform this Arabic Islamic education in India. That conversation has started by the time Shibli begins writing the Travelogue. And I think that part of what he's doing in this text is laying out a kind of roadmap for what the state of education in these areas of Islamic governance, as he calls them, in the Ottoman Empire in Egypt, and teasing out elements from them for this institution that he's imagining as it's being the identity is still being formed. A couple of things. So those of you who are familiar, I see someone whose last name in here is Nadwi, and I know that Andrew and I were just talking about Nadwatul Ulama. So for those of you who are not familiar with Nadwatul Ulama, this is an institution that was formed in the 1890s. It eventually opened its own sort of academy in Lucknow. It's still an academy in Lucknow, and it's been a site for the production of some of the most influential scholars of Islam and Arabic in particular in the 20th century. It is scholars not only from South Asia, but scholars who travel to Nadwatul Ulama for education, Ibrahim Musa and others, right? And Shibli is one of the founders of this institution. But the institution was founded not as an academy. In fact, that was specifically not what Nadwatul Ulama was to be. In fact, Nadwatul Ulama was intended to be something similar to what the colonial university system was. That is to say, a body of scholars with various institutional affiliations who would come together and agree about the curriculum of studies in Arabic for madrasas all over British India and in the princely states. And so in its initial years, Nadwatul Ulama was an organization that attracted and invited scholars of a wide range of ideological and sectarian backgrounds. In its first year, there was a Shia scholar who was invited to participate. That was soon the Shia scholars were explicitly, by I think 1896, disinvited from Nadwatul Ulama. But in its initial moment, the idea for Nadwa was that this was going to be about Islamic education and Arabic education in general. And so that kind of institutional power, right, to set the agenda for the education of Muslims all across British India and in the princely states is something that Shibli was very interested in being a part of, because he was one of the few kind of really well-known reformers who had actually been trained in that very tradition, right? So Syed Ahmad Khan famously, the sort of major reformer of Indian Muslims of the 19th century, has a kind of more tenuous kind of relationship with Arabic and Islamic studies. Altaf Hussain Hali was a little bit more of an autodidact. Muhammad Hussain Azad, this other kind of major Indian sort of scholar, thinker, social reformer of a certain kind, he's someone who's actually trained in a colonial college, right? Knows Arabic, but trained in a kind of colonial institution. Shibli's background is quite conventional for his time in terms of the curriculum of Arabic and Islamic studies that we now have come to call the Dars-e-Nizami, right? And Shibli was discipled to a renowned scholar of the Arabic rational sciences, Farooq Chiraiya Koti, and spends his youth kind of studying with him. Shibli studies all of the Mantiq textbooks. He reads, the commentaries on, this Sulumul Ulum by Bihari. I mean, these are the kinds of things that Shibli's trained in. And so he has a very intimate knowledge of that canon of text / curriculum and method of studies. And when he's writing the travelogue, he's thinking about this broader project to reform Arabic Islamic education. He's thinking about the soon-to-be emergence of Nadwatul Ulama as the most powerful, potentially the most powerful reformist institution for that part of the Arabic Islamic for the Arabic Islamic curriculum in South Asia. And so the travelogue, without doubt, without any doubt, sort of is attempting to make interventions in that particular history, right? It is laying out an agenda. It's telling the reader that the Darul Ulum in Egypt is the institution that should be followed if we're attempting to create a hybridized model. It is laying out an agenda in which it's saying that it's possible to teach English and Arabic well at the same time in an academy. And of course, in sort of broad ideological terms, this is what Shibli attempts to do at Nadwa. That was sort of his agenda, right? And this is what is met with resistance by other members of the Nadwa establishment. Should we teach English? Should we not? Et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, in the 1890s, when Nadwa was just getting off the ground, and it didn't have an academy yet, but it decided that it was going to go in that direction, Shibli tries to send students to the Darul Uloom in Egypt. And it doesn't work out. The prerequisites for joining the academy and being enrolled there aren't met by the students. And so there's a very, there's a kind of an ideological influence of the travelogue, but there's also a very on the ground historical sort of networks influence of the travelogue. That when Shibli comes back with all of this information about the institutions that exist in Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, he then tries to kind of create very specific kinds of connections between what's going on at the institutions in South Asia and the institutions elsewhere. As one final connection, I'll mention, because you talked about not having access to information, not having the internet and things like that. Shibli did have access to information about happenings in the Ottoman Empire and Egypt. Syed Ahmad Khan, in his journalism, would often publish news about what was going on in the Middle East, and would actually translate news items into Urdu. Sometimes he would copy sort of articles in Arabic and then translate them in Urdu. So there was actually a lot of flow of information. And of course, book distributors in places like Kanpur were distributing contemporary scholarship in South Asia, scholarship coming out of Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. So it was possible to get one's hands on, a lot of scholarship, etc. But what the travelogue certainly does, at least if Shibli is to be believed, is it brings Arabic journalism to South Asia. I mean, this is a claim that Shibli makes in the travelogue, right? And specifically, what Shibli brings to Aligarh is the literary magazine and journal Al-Hilal of Jurji Zaidan, yes? And begins teaching this journal to a circle of interested students at Aligarh by 1894. I mean, there's that footnote in the travelogue where he sort of talks about implementing this. And it's in that same context that he says, hey, this kind of thing, modern Arabic journalism, modern Arabic literature, this should actually be read by students at our madrasas in South Asia, right? And so there you have a kind of both that intervention that he's trying to make as a reformer, thinking about the direction of Nahdlatul Ulama and what it may sort of contribute to Arabic Islamic education in South Asia in an ideological kind of sense, but also in a very practical, concrete sense that he's now subscribing to Jurji Zaidan's magazine, and he's reading it on a monthly basis with his students. And the relationship between Jurji Zaidan and Shibli is one that lasts for about 20 years. In the early 20th century, Shibli is the secretary of the Anjuman-e-Taraqqiye Urdu, the Society for the Promotion of Urdu Literature, and they're trying to compile a dictionary with scientific technical terms and their equivalents to aid in the broader project of translating contemporary scientific literature into Urdu. And they don't have such a dictionary. And Shibli writes to Jurji Zaidan and says, hey, can you send us a dictionary that has the Arabic equivalents of these technical terms in English in the sciences? And Zaidan writes back and says, oh, I don't know of any such dictionary. And so it's an intellectual relationship that lasts. And then, of course, eventually Shibli criticizes Zaidan in print, and that leads to a controversy in Egypt, and the relationship is eventually severed just before Shibli passes. But those kinds of relationships are formed through his travels, yeah, and they last in his life and pop up now and then. I should say, as I'm on the subject of networks and relationships, that one thing that's remarkable and I found quite remarkable when I first read the travelogue, was that while on the one hand, you encounter references to Jurdi Zaidan later in Shibli's letters and in his writings and sort of archival material and things like that, one doesn't encounter a large number of references to Muhammad Abdu, for example. And I sort of was interested to see if, there's this encounter in the travelogue between Shibli and Muhammad Abdu, both kind of major reformers. And I was interested to see either if they, there are no letters surviving as far as I know between the two. But I was interested to see if Shibli in his own letters mentions Muhammad Abdu. He doesn't really. If Muhammad Abdu ever mentions the encounter with Shibli, and as far as I can tell, I looked through Muhammad Abdu's letters and I don't see any kind of serious mention of this. There's an article that Shibli wrote about education, kind of a news report that Shibli wrote about the state of education at Azhar when Shibli was the editor of a magazine, kind of an intellectual magazine, a scientific magazine at Aligarh in the 1890s. And there he mentions him briefly, but doesn't say anything about his own personal relationship with him or anything like that. And so on the one hand, there are sort of certain relationships that are obviously really significant for Shibli. And then it seems like some of the relationships that are formed, some of the encounters and exchanges don't last. And that I think is also an important contribution of the travelogue itself, is it opens up the possibility of forming new relationships and networks and exploring them. And it also gives you an interesting sense of the limitations of those relationships and the kinds of relationships that are not part of what Shibli's broader project is.
It's interesting that you say that, because if you read the travelogue, the names of two scholars actually stand out as people who Shibli seeks out and then praises afterwards. Muhammad Abdu is one, and the other one is Tahir al-Maghribi or al-Jazairi. And so it's interesting that you mention how, with regards to Abdu, and I'm guessing it might be the same with al-Maghribi as well, is that there's this kind of impression given by the travelogue as a standalone piece of work, that these are significant people for Shibli. But then if you look at his work afterwards, there doesn't seem to be that sort of acknowledgement. So it's interesting that you made that point, because I think people who pick up just the travelogue will be like, oh, okay, has he found a kindred spirit in both of them? Because they're the two scholars who actually stand out in the work.
Yeah, I mean, Tahir al-Maghribi is someone who's only, there's a good article about him from several years ago, I think, but someone who's only now beginning to gain a lot of attention. There's some recent work that's been done on him. He sort of founds the Zakaria Library and really a major scholar. But yeah, exactly. Very few references to him. Now, one thing that's interesting, and this is again part of the Shibli mania part of my work, where I just, as an intellectual biographer, I'm interested in what Shibli read and how he read it and when he read it and all of that. And he, looking at some of the books that he's using in his later scholarship, particularly his work on Kalam and theology, he does use a couple of critical editions by Tahir al-Maghribi that were published and made available. And so he continues to engage with him, but very indirectly. There are no references to his ideas, but one can assume that he, he had a copy of a critical edition of, I've forgotten which scholar's work it is, maybe Ibn Taymiyyah, I can't recall. And one can imagine that Shibli sort of looked at the cover and read the introduction and said, oh, I met this person, if he recognized the name and made the connection. But that's about as much as we get. There's not sort of this, deep ongoing engagement. And I'm not exactly sure how to make sense of that, right? On the one hand, there is the sense that Shibli's concerns although he's writing this travelogue, he's talking about Muslims across borders. He's talking about sort of, I mean, there's a lot in the travelogue about Muslim belonging across the borders of empire, right? And so in that sense, to use a kind of a recent academic frame and buzzword, it's very cosmopolitan, right? This approach that he has. Yet on the other hand, Shibli's focus again is very localized. It's very much about what's going on with Muslims in British India and to some extent the princely states. And so sort of thinking about, you know, the global situation of Muslims, thinking about how reforms in the Ottoman Empire can be implemented in South Asia. And this is not something that is sort of at the fore of his thoughts for most of his academic life. He sort of continues to see himself as a historian of classical Islam, be it of theology or of literature or of you know, philosophers and jurisprudence or statesmen, and as a kind of educational reformer for South Asia. And there's that really interesting tension, I think. You asked again about the contributions of the travelogue. There's a really interesting tension in this text between the cosmopolitan and the local, the kind of non-cosmopolitan, the sort of very much here and now aspect of what it is that he's trying to do, again, as a reformer, as an educator, as a researcher, and very aware that while there's a great deal about, that is, Shibli's quite aware that although there's a great deal about belonging and Muslim community in the travelogue, there's also a lot about Indianness in the travelogue, right? I mean, sort of not finding certain foods very tasty because he wishes he could eat his Indian foods, right? Sort of not finding certain forms of dress very appealing. I mean, he has some very unkind things to say about certain ways of dressing, right? And you know, that kind of judgment remains a part of that kind of perspective that is not as, let's call it, cosmopolitan as you know, some of the ideas about belonging might otherwise lead us to believe. Yeah, he's a Muslim, and you know, a Muslim beyond borders, right? But he's also someone who's very much an Indian, very South Asian, and that's, I think, an important intervention in our study of cosmopolitanism as it's been in the last several decades.
I'll maybe just touch on one last point before we open it up to the audience. But it's interesting you talk about his personality as an Indian who has this tension between his cosmopolitanism as well as then his local focus. But one thing that strikes me in the travelogue is that it's a very, although there's lots of humor and it's very personable when you see his interactions with people, it's quite an impersonal one in so much as he doesn't relate any experiences to his actual life. So there's nothing happens on the journey that makes him say, oh, and with my father, this happened, or with my teachers, this happened, or in India, this happened. He's very generic and talks about the state of education in India in general, state of Indian society in general. Why do you think he was so focused on being very impersonal in that sense and not really relating anything to his life? It's as though there's a clear agenda and he doesn't let other things muddy those waters.
Wow, thank you for that question. Yeah. Again, I think to some extent, so, you know, we've been talking about sort of cosmopolitanism and the richness, the very humanizing aspects of the text. There's also a lot of really boring passages in the text. Yeah, you'll have noticed. I mean, just sort of long lists of like, what are the different social organizations and who are their leaders and what's their communal sort of identity and how much money do they have and how many students of this background study there, right? And so, you know, part of the reason for that must be that this is also kind of a report of a certain kind that he's filing to the public, right? who is his public? Urdu readers, people interested in Islam, people interested in education, right? And so I think to some extent, he doesn't get into that sort of personal autobiographical mode. He does a little bit in his letters, you see, to his father. He talks about his feelings and his experiences. And he is comfortable being autobiographical in his journal articles later in life. So he does talk about his early education a little bit. He shares anecdotes about his father in Sher al-Ajam, his study of Persian poetry. So it's not that he's sort of unwilling to be autobiographical in print, right? But I would think that it has something to do with, again, this sort of broader agenda, that this is actually a work of scholarship of sorts, that he's attempting to document archives, to talk about how archives are organized, how are people building libraries up, what kinds of subjects are being taught, who's studying what, where, how much money does such an organization have, what are the books that are being published, are they being censored, are they not being censored, if they are being censored, is that acceptable and why not, right? Because Shibli, of course, doesn't believe it's acceptable. And that's something that I think is not a space in which he feels like, oh yes, I should be studying, or I should be sharing my sort of innermost thoughts and reflecting about reflecting on my childhood and my education with Farooq Chiraiya Koti or Faizul Hasan Saharanpuri and these other people that he studied with as a student. So yeah, it's a great question. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. Why didn't Shibli be a little bit more intimate with his subject? But something to think about as I move forward. Thank you for that question.
No problem at all. No, Max, I could listen to you for ages, and it'd be very selfish of me to do so. So I think we're share things out with the audience now.
Sure. I've sent you a list of the questions, Andrew. If you want to filter out the ones that you think are appropriate.
Have you filtered any out yet, Mizan? I haven't read them yet.
Have a quick read. If there are okay, we've got a hand coming up. Let me just take that as a priority. It's Huzaifa Nadwi. Can you be prepared to unmute? And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, I think. Yeah, Bismillah.
Yeah, thank you for that, Nadir Sahab. And we'll be looking forward to listening to some of your poetry in Khumar Baravan Kavis Tarannum.
Oh my goodness.
I just wanted to ask you regarding this question. It's actually, I have a few questions, but this one question that came to us right at the beginning of the travelogue, where he says that writing of travelogues has generally stopped in our community some time ago. And I find that interesting because I think just 20 years before he writes this travelogue, Hakim Dulhai Hasni, he writes a travelogue, Delhi aur uska itraf. So I'm not sure why he makes this comment, and I'm also interested in who these scholars and friends were who demanded that he writes the travelogue as well. Would you happen to know that? Or yeah.
Thank you. That's such an important question in my view. I thank you so much. So I say in the afterword that there's a little bit of a kind of the Jahule Arifana about this. Yeah, we would say in Urdu, sort of a knowing kind of feigned ignorance of some kind, right? Because of course there was a lot of travel writing happening in the late 19th century in Urdu. I can't remember now, but his name, it's in the afterword to the text. I could search quickly through it and find it. But there was a figure in the 1870s and 80s, a real globetrotter who was going all over the world and writing travelogues about his experiences. You mentioned Abdul Hayy al-Hassani's travelogue, very famous. Thank you for that. So there is a number of travelogues that circulate. And my sense is that on the one hand, this is a move that a lot of reformers make. They kind of make a very bold, exaggerated claim about a lack of something in order to sort of, in order that there be a clear problem to be addressed. And I think that's probably something, there's something to that in this context, right? Sort of saying nobody writes travelogues, no sort of, let's say, Urdu writers or maybe Muslim writers in South Asia write travelogues anymore. Well, that's not true. Now, one question is, did Shibli know about them? It's possible that he didn't, but Shibli was fairly well connected to journals in which travel writing was being published in the 1880s. So it seems unlikely that he would be totally oblivious to them. And so I don't have an answer for you. Why would he make this claim? But I agree with you that it is a little bit strange and one that needs some kind of contextualization to be understood. Your second question was about who these people are who are encouraging him to write this book. Yeah, and again, we simply don't know. I mean, it seems from his letters that Syed Ahmad Khan sort of had a conversation with him about the importance of there being a travelogue. Shibli sort of talks about there being enough material to produce one. And so it seems that perhaps Syed Ahmad Khan may have been someone who encouraged him. That becomes kind of a controversial point later in the literature with Hayat-e Shibli and the claims that Sayyid Suleiman Nadvi makes about this text in that book. But Syed Ahmad Khan seems to be someone who would have encouraged him. And one also imagines, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that he's preparing to sort of join the leadership of Nadwatul Ulama leads me to suspect that people like Altaf Hussain Hali, Mumtaz Ali, and these other figures who begin to play this kind of leading role in reform, not necessarily only at Nadwatul Ulama, but as writers and institution builders in their own right, they're part of that conversation saying, this is something that we need in order to show the sort of this institution of Nadwa, Arabic Islamic studies as a field more broadly. We need to show them what's going on over in the Ottoman Empire and Egypt and what we can kind of take away from your experiences and observations there. Yeah. Did I answer your questions?
So yeah, I think that's it. Andrew, do you want to look at the
Yeah,
chat?
I'll take some questions from the chat.
Please, yeah.
Slightly amend them. So Arshima Chump has got a question about Shibli's views on educational reform in comparison to his contemporaries. And I maybe like to add to that is that can we sort of, there's this, we discussed it earlier, but this idea that there are quote unquote modernist, there were rather, sorry, quote unquote modernist Nadwis and then traditionalist Nadwis.
Mm-hmm.
And that Jan Peter Hartung talks about this, and that Shibli is the leader of the modernist Nadwis who eventually loses out to the traditionalist turn. Or is it, so you have this sort of tension with his contemporaries on educational reform within Nadwa itself, or is it best not to describe Shibli as a modernist, as his case is more complex? And this is something I think which Ahmed Hassan highlighted in his very critical review of Meher Murad's intellectual modernism of Shibli Numani, in that it's not so easy and neat to put him in either camp. But yeah, how would you place him with his contemporaries in terms of educational reform?
Well, a couple of things. So first is that this term of modern, right, is one that is sort of burdened by a long history of sort of late Orientalist scholarship that carries over into what someone might call the post-Orientalist period, right? Post-Orientalism period, really, after Said. And, you know, for someone like Hardy, to be a modern scholar is really about one's engagement with Europe, about English. Shibli was an advocate for English education at Nadwa. He tried to sort of make sure that there were English teachers there, This was done for ideological reasons as well as financial ones. There was funding available. If you had an English teacher, you would get government money for the study of English and for the study of mathematics, right? Non-religious subjects. And so he's someone who is sort of committed to English education. And in that sense, for someone who's working within a framework of modernity, which looks at modern as a concept that labels, or a word that labels a certain kind of scholar, like Syed Ahmad Khan, who believes in European education, in English education, Shibli's a modern scholar. The people who oppose English education at Madhva, right? They would be traditionalists. They would be non-modern scholars, right? That's a little bit, I'm being a little bit reductive in this sense. There are other things as well. So, you know, Shibli, as someone who wants to teach sciences through Arabic, right? That might also qualify him, etc. That is modern European sciences through Arabic. But in general, that's kind of the way it's been broken down. And then, of course, there's another sense of modern, which has to do with a certain kind of propensity to reform versus those who want to lean heavily on what they see as a tradition and are kind of averse to certain kinds of reform. And again, Shibli comes down on the modernist side of things in that way of thinking about what it means to be modern. And there's a wonderful book which is problematic, but also very helpful. Modernist versus fundamentalist debates in Islam in English is a kind of classic that lays out this distinction, right? For my part, I think two things are very interesting. One is that, as you rightly point out, a large number of scholars label Shibli very comfortably as modern, and a similarly large number of scholars very comfortably label Shibli as a traditionalist, because he's someone who ultimately is really interested in Arabic. He's really interested in Islamic studies. He wants to make sure that Arabic doesn't fall off as there's this kind of push toward a more sort of English medium education more generally in British India. And so there's scholars who talk about him without any kind of hesitation as being a sort of a traditionalist scholar. And I think that the last point you made is a really good one, which is that that's part of what makes him so interesting, is that he doesn't really conform to any of these labels easily. Yeah. Yes, he advocates English education. He also is someone who believes in the value of Arabic learning, even as he is attempting to reform what he calls the Dars-e-Nizamiya curriculum, this curriculum of Arabic language texts, a curriculum that sort of emphasizes the rational sciences, even as he's critical of, you know, the emphasis on logic textbooks and this massive corpus of logic textbooks. He's also someone who writes in a very personal, intimate way about how that training in Arabic rationalism forms an essential part of who he is as a thinker. And you can tell from that writing that he's not interested in jettisoning this altogether, that what he wants to do is accommodate English, accommodate studying Arabic literature, modern Arabic, accommodate the study of sort of classical theological texts, Ibn Rushd, Al-Ghazali, etc. And that requires a negotiation with this classical curriculum, so that it won't be enough just to say, okay, we're going to study English on the side as we continue to teach Bihari and the Shamsiya and Mirqat and, you know, all of these other sort of rational and texts in Arabic. We're going to have to get rid of a few of those so that we can accommodate a little more English studies, a little bit of Ghazali, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not really a modernist position, as I outlined earlier, according to the categories as we receive them, nor is it a traditionalist opinion, according to the categories as we've received them. This is someone who, I mean, I don't want to give away my monograph project, but is the way that I frame this problem in the introduction to the book that I'm working on is that Shibli is someone, like many scholars of his generation, who is ultimately attempting to come to terms with encounters with new ideas. And that doesn't mean modernity versus tradition. It means how do we come to encounter the revival of classical Arabic literature in print, texts that were rare texts that only a handful of copies of which existed are now widely available, and we can read them whenever we want. We can write histories about the classical period that would have been impossible to write for someone in Shibli's position 2-3 generations earlier. At the same time, there's all of this scientific literature, some of which is coming to Shibli in Arabic through Egypt. I talk about that a little bit in the afterword of the travelogue. And there's also, English medium education in British India that's talking about physics and all kinds of things. There's spiritualism coming up in Europe. He talks about that in his theological works. And so there's all of these new ideas. And Shibli is someone who is attempting to engage those new ideas on their own terms and to incorporate them into this broader project he has it's a historical project, it's a reformers project, it's a kind of literary critical project, a theological project. And so I would shy away, and I do shy away in my book, from modernist versus traditionalist. And I think it's a much more productive way to frame him. And I think the travelogue in many ways embodies this spirit, to frame him as someone who's, again, encountering new ideas and attempting to come to terms with them, given his background and the agendas that are set around him, be it Nahdlatul Ulama in the case of the travelogue, reform in the case of the travelogue, or his education in and what he is imagining himself to do as a teacher of Arabic and Persian in the colonial college.
We've got a question from if we can take this from where's he gone? Shireen Tareen. Tareen.
Yeah, if you can unmute Dr. Ali Tareen.
Yeah, I'm just doing that. Yeah.
Oh, great. Ahlan wa sahlan, Shari.
Well, thank you, Max, for this wonderful book, and thank you to Andrew for telling me about this event, and to Mizan for hosting these wonderful book talks. This sounds like such an excellent text, not only to read, but also to teach in different courses, undergraduate and graduate. So thank you for doing the service for us, Max. I had a couple of
thank you.
Brief questions, sort of very broad questions, which connect to this point that you were just making, an excellent point about going past the traditionalism, modernism binary. I was wondering, do you get a sense from Shibli in this text or from the other intellectual corpus that you, of course, are an expert in, about his views on, or is he at all interested in the question of Muslim, non-Muslim relations and boundary making, etc.? Because that's, of course, a key theme about for which many reformers were very invested in at that time. So I was wondering, is he at all interested in that question? If yes, how does that reflect in this text or any of his other corpus? And secondly, does he compare and contrast the Ottoman state and the British state at any point about their views about religion, religious communities, etc.? Do we see any kind of comparison between the Ottoman and British state in his work? So those two sort of questions.
I'm writing them down so I can make sure I answer them. Muslim versus non-Muslim. One thing that's really interesting, this is such an important question and it's impossible to answer. I'm going to do my best and I'll try to be as concise as I can. I know I have a tendency to ramble a little bit. It's not something, so Shibli, very interestingly, from very early in his career, takes the category of sort of Musalman, right, as a kind of a given, right? That this is something that he's not interrogating, especially in his early writings. Yeah, I mean, his first kind of major work, the one that really kind of makes a name for him, is his biography of Ma'mun, the Abbasid Caliph, right? And in that text, in the introduction to it, he talks about sort of Muslims having a history beyond South Asia, Muslims being more or less unaware of many aspects of that history, and what we need to do as a Qawm is kind of, you know, come to have greater knowledge of those legacies, right? I mean, and so the category of Muslim is something that he just assumes as a kind of accessible category, one that doesn't need to be interrogated, challenged, or thought about, at least in his early writings. What happens, I think, in his intellectual life is that in the early 20th century, with the kind of rise of nationalism, that is, you know, in the 1900s, that first decade, right, where you really begin to see a split, a linguistic, religious, communal kind of split, Hindi, Hindu, Urdu, Muslim, these kinds of things. It's in that context that he really begins to think about the ways in which Muslims are relating to non-Muslims, both in South Asia and more broadly beyond South Asia. And so, you know, he begins writing journal articles about, you know, listen, you know, there is no kind of essential relationship between language and community, that, you know, some of the finest journalists and writers in Urdu are Hindus, for example, right? So this becomes a point that he begins to kind of push a bit more. He becomes interested in what is the Persian work on Braj Bhasha, literary aesthetics and poetics, Tuhfatul Hind, which is made in the Mughal period. And he's sort of writes a very famous, very productive early article studying Tuhfatul Hind, in which he talks about the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims and sort of Islamicate, Arabicate, Persianate forms of knowledge in their relationship to kind of Indic, Sanskritic knowledge systems. But it's something that I think for him, this category of the Musalman, right, is something that he sort of carries through to the end of his life as something that's given, right? I mean, it's not something for him that needs to be sort of analyzed and interrogated in a kind of direct way. But something that I also would, I thank you for asking the question, because I think it's one that I'm going to take back to my writing and think through a little bit more, because it's something that, again, is really important and yet always at the margins for him. Because again, he's someone, you know, I mean, his series that he sets out to write in the 1880s, The Heroes of Islam, is just sort of, you know, he's someone who's just thinking about Muslims and Islamic history, right? Syed Ahmad Khan is someone who's really thinking about Muslims and Hindus and communities, and Shibli, that's sort of not his project, yeah? And that, I think, is an important distinction. In terms of the comparison of the Ottoman and British states, I mean, I think that there is an implicit critique to some extent in the Travelogue of British colonialism. And sometimes it's explicit, as I mentioned, not only the kind of, you know, reading European literature and is like taking a soporific drug, etc., but also in sort of the subtle ways that he sort of critiques the encroachment of British power on the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, his critiques of what he sees as a lack of intellectual freedom in the Ottoman Empire, his critique of censorship in Ottoman texts, I think is to some extent an implicit sort of an implicit kind of claim about Egypt. About, remember, he's visiting Egypt when it's occupied by the British, right? And this is the space in which he's really beginning to kind of engage with literature, and he begins importing Egyptian editions of texts, and he wants to read Egyptian journalism. And so there is a kind of implicit critique of the Ottoman state in terms of knowledge production that may, in a sense, be sort of a defense of what he sees both in the Travelogue and elsewhere as the kind of the logic of colonialism that he sees as legitimate, right? Freedom of the press and these kind of liberal ideas that he embraces and sort of not just in the Travelogue, but elsewhere as well.
Thank you, Max. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheikh Ali.
It's a pleasure to speak with you as well. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting, Max, because it seems as though when you read the Travelogue, Shibli is the perfect colonial subject. He doesn't want to rock the boat at all. So when he gets the Majidi medal, he wants to check in with the authorities. You know, can I accept it as an Indian? He goes back. He says, and in the letter that you included in one of the appendices, where he writes to Sayyid Ahmed Khan and says, "Can we use this to get me the Shams al-Ulama title from the British?"
Right.
But Ahmed Hassan from Pakistan, I mentioned before his review on Mahar Murad's book, he refers to Shibli talking about Muslim, non-Muslim working together. Do you see that as something sort of a type of Indian National Congress type of approach that he developed later? Because there's the argument you touch upon, this whole idea about the Travelogue and the debate between Suleiman Nadwi and Zubairi on its pan-Islamic implications. Do you think that in some ways the Travelogue represents a type of political awakening? Maybe not in the terms that Suleiman Nadwi wants to portray it as fully, or maybe even not as fully as Zubairi wants to portray it, but somewhere in between where there is something of a political awakening from that journey.
I mean, I don't know that I would characterize the Travelogue as a text of political awakening. And here's why. Let me see, I'm going to hazard a very bold answer, so you'll have to indulge me and forgive me. I know that this is going to be made available online and published, and so I'm going to try to be reserved, but I want to also have courage and say the thoughts as they come. So, the categories that Shibli is using, right? His interaction with, to kind of pick up again on Sher Ali Tareen's question from a moment ago, his interaction with non-Muslim communities on his journey, right, or in his journey, on his travel, during his travels. The afternoon he spends with Antun Salihani, right, Professor Antun, as he's called in the Travelogue. The sort of consciousness of his own Indianness. These are categories that are not sort of, categories of rupture that are, being brought to bear on his interpretation of politics, ethics, society, Islam, community, that have no grounding or precedent in the traditions, especially the Persianate traditions that he inherits, right? And so his sort of sense of himself as a Musalman, his sense of himself as an Indian, as a Hindustani, right? These are things that I think are engaged with, the way that these categories are used in, Persian literature. Sort of the Gulistan of Sadi sort of, tradition, right? There are these different types and they interact with each other. And they remain their types, but they also kind of learn and they're comfortable and they move with each other and things like that. So I want to say on the one hand that he's someone who is certainly, again, encountering new ideas, bringing his background to bear on that encounter. I don't think I would be comfortable saying that there's a political awakening happening here. His awareness of sort of the sense of belonging among Muslims across borders, right? That's not something that's unprecedented in the literary and intellectual and cultural traditions that he is kind of raised in. Yeah. The specific question about whether or not this is a pan-Islamic text, whether this is a political text, if Shibli had to censor himself, which is sort of what Sayyid Suleiman Nadwi claims, right? That question is fraught because we don't really have evidence, to tell us exactly, exactly to what extent we can kind of, not that we can, not a question of belief as much as we just don't have enough information. We don't know from Shibli's letters or other sources what his attitudes about this experience and what his attitudes about this text were. But in terms of the text itself, I mean, maybe I'll ask you, having read it, I mean, are you struck by a certain kind of like political agenda in the text, or?
Myself, I think the emphasis, I think, on the text is him as an educational reformer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, his eulogizing of Sultan Abdul Hamid is very stark. And I can see to a certain extent why Suleiman Nadwi would jump on that, because it's so emotionally charged. And when he writes to his father as well, but even just the poem he writes about Sultan Abdul Hamid, which you so it's with a great translation. But it doesn't strike me as a full-on kind of pan-Islamic type of reawakening. But at the same time, the fact that he's willing to be that pro-Ottoman makes me think that he's not so obedient to Sayyid Ahmed Khan's kind of political outlook either. And so maybe I'm falling perhaps between Suleiman Nadwi and Zubairi in some ways. And I'm not seeing it as overtly political, but I can see indications of where you can see a slight difference to Sayyid Ahmed Khan and maybe the Aligarh establishment.
I mean, I would say a couple of things. So to repeat the point, but maybe with more clarity, because you've given this really great example. You know, the praise of Abdul Hamid is also quite formulaic. It's very rich, right? I mean, the protector of Musliman, right? But it's also very formulaic. I mean, and these are sort of, you know, categories that, you know, one finds in, you know, classical Persian literature when one is dedicating a text to some patron, right? And so I think one has to guard a little bit against overreading that as a kind of personal, effusive testimony to his, you know, political beliefs, and to sort of read it against its literary context and ask, okay, when he says these things, aren't those just formula for badshahs in Persian literature? And indeed, they typically are, right? So the emperor is always called these things, right? And that, of course, is, and this is a really important point, that, of course, is also something that was Shibli's job at the time. One of his jobs was as a teacher of Persian and Arabic at Aligarh, right? But his other job was as a kind of poet laureate for the institution. And so when major figures like the Nizam would come to visit, major donors would come to visit, he would write these long praise poems in Persian for them that he would recite at, you know, in front of them at their court, or not at their court, at sort of dinners and things like that, as if he were reciting poetry for a king at a court. Yeah. And so that's something that I think one has to keep in mind when reading that poetry, is that it's fairly formulaic, it's quite generic in that sense. You know, Shibli later talks about loyalty in a very famous article on Khilafat. Yeah. And Sayyid Suleiman Nadvi goes so far in Hayat-e Shibli as to claim that Shibli didn't even write this article. And that is quite conspiratorial in a sense. Yes, I mean, the idea that, you know, in Shibli's lifetime something would come out and Shibli would not have written it or wrote it under duress or something like that, and there would be no evidence or mention of this elsewhere. I don't think I am quite convinced by those claims. And so, you know, and Shibli basically claims that, you know, Abdul Hamid, because citizens in India, or, you know, the subjects of the crown have the freedom to practice their religion, they don't have a sort of a duty to have an allegiance to Abdul Hamid as a kind of as the Khalifa, yeah, as the Caliph of Islam. And of course, and then Shibli, of course, also is someone who's very much, especially at the end of his life, engaged in Indian politics. He's someone who at the end of his life writes a very famous series of articles recently studied by Aisha Jalal, in which he advocates that the Muslim League abandon what he calls a certain kind of parliamentarianism and align itself with the agendas of Congress. It aligned itself with the kind of social reform, economic reform agendas of Congress, bring up farmers, make sure that people in rural areas have access to food, education, and things like that. And these are not the kinds of intellectual frameworks for someone who is thinking about sort of pan-Islamic political structures or sort of exclusively Muslim Islamic political structures. So it's an impossible question to answer, but at the same time, I don't want to say that there's nothing relevant there in terms of his broader intellectual political trajectory. But it's just hard to tease out exactly what that might be and what that might look like.
Max, I'm very conscious of the time that we've taken.
Oh, yes.
So I'm going to finish with one question from Aisha Sayyid, which perhaps rounds everything up. And that's talking about I'm just extracting from her question. What would you say was the impact of Shibli on the century after him in this Indian continent?
Well, that's such a great question. So I would actually say that the impact of Shibli has been much broader than the kind of piecemeal scholarship about him so far has kind of shown. And this is not something that I would do in my study of him because I'm really interested in his life. But let's think about some various contexts in which he's been influential. Al-Faruq and Al-Mamun have been read as part of state education curricula since the early 20th century. Al-Mamun was adopted by the the colonial university system as a textbook for Urdu studies, starting in the 1920s, 30s, something like that. Yeah, Al-Faruq remains. I mean, I have a little reader for I think 10th grade Urdu studies in Pakistan from 5 years ago in my office, and Al-Faruq is excerpt from Al-Faruq is the first text in the reader. Yeah, so Shibli has been his ideas have been part of the circulation of knowledge in South Asia around Urdu, around Urdu literature, around Islam for really since he died in 1914. He's been a controversial figure. He's someone whose writings, especially on theology, got a lot of pushback. And yet, as a controversial figure and as a canonical figure, he's also someone who continues to exert influence, even as people kind of sort of push back against what they see as ideas of his that are perhaps too radical or something like that, right? I mean, the famous sort of fatwas against him, the judgments against him by Ashraf Ali Thanvi, by Abdul Haq Haqqani, are sort of good examples of that kind of resistance to him, but also being a part of that reception and influence. There are other aspects of his influence as well. We all know that we've talked a lot about Shibli. We haven't talked about some of his students, one of whom is Hamiduddin Farahi, whose influence on Islahi and then eventually down to Ghamidi today in Pakistan remains something to be kind of teased out and sort of really kind of contextualized historically and studied as a kind of intellectual lineage of sorts. And so there's a kind of influence of a Shiblian orientation there. Many of the most influential foundational works of South Asian studies in Urdu of the 20th century and about Urdu were written by his students. So I mean, if we think about, Abul Kalam Azad as a student of Shibli's and someone who in many ways sort of carries forward some of Shibli's projects, intellectual projects. His tafsir in many ways emerges from Shibli's late writings on what a modern tafsir ought to look like. And also his political projects as well, sort of again aligning with Congress and things like that. Sayyid Sulaiman Nadvi, Darul Musannifin authors, Abu Salam Nadvi, Abdul Salam Nadvi is another one who's writing sort of this major work on Iqbal-i-Kamil, which sort of sets the Iqbalian trajectory in South Asia for years. Sher al-Hind, of course, is a very famous study of Urdu literature. So there are these students of Shibli's who really, and you know, there's a kind of a lot of lineage naming where, oh, so-and-so is a student and so-and-so is a student, right? The Ali brothers, of course, are another pair. But there's a real kind of concrete way in which a lot of these figures take up projects that Shibli had imagined for the future, both for himself and for his students, and complete them. You know, Shibli is someone who is part of the group who's introducing new Persian poets into the curriculum of studies at the university. Ibn Yamin, for example. It's not a coincidence that Abdul Salam Nadvi translates a biography of that poet, Ibn Yamin, from Persian into Urdu 20 years later, right? When it's finally written in Persian. So there's a lot of this influences direct, right? I mean, you know, Siratul Nabi and these texts that Shibli writes are read, but there's also a lot of this indirect kind of influence where people who are in positions of intellectual influence are kind of taking up his projects. But what I wouldn't want to do is say that that's exclusive to South Asia. So here's a couple of really neat examples. The translator of Shibli's first, the translator of the first volume of Siratul Nabi is Fazlur Rahman, who, of course, is influential in Pakistan in the 50s and 60s, but then moves to the United States and becomes this immensely influential philosopher, historian, theologian at the University of Chicago, and writes a handful of the most influential works on Islamic theology, on sort of Islamic community and politics, Islam in the modern world. You'll find references to Shibli throughout Fazlur Rahman's articles and books, in part because he also translated Shibli early in his career and paid very close attention to Shibli's ideas. And of course, if you were to go and pick up, you know, Sher Ali Tareen mentioned earlier about teaching a text like this. If you were to go and pick up as a teacher or as a student, if you were to take a course on Islam and pick up the Oxford University Makers of the Muslim World thin little book on Umar, you would discover that its author, in English, of course, its author is Shibli Numani, that the translation, the 2-volume translation of Al-Faruq into English was excerpted by Oxford University Press and is still the kind of English language brief introduction to Umar for the kind of academic university world. So the influence of his ideas and his perspective is not limited to Urdu and South Asia, but through translation and through kind of influential scholars, South Asian and like in South Asia and also in the Euro-American Academy. These ideas are being, his ideas are being transmitted across the borders of language and nation state. A last example I'll give of that, of course, is that Sherul Ajam, his sort of magisterial study of Persian poetry, was almost immediately translated into Persian, was then retranslated into Persian, and has been kind of a standard text for the study of Persian poetry in Afghanistan and in Iran for the past century. And there's a couple of scholars right now who are working on that legacy and reception of his ideas as well. And so it's a wonderful question, which I really appreciate the opportunity to answer, because I think it's often the case that as a Shibli, a student really of Shibli's life and ideas, I often have to kind of explain, you know, who is this Shibli Numani and why would we want to study his ideas and life so closely. And it's one of these difficult questions to answer, because of course he's sort of everywhere, right? I mean, he did so much, he wrote so much, and he's such a formative and was such a prominent thinker that his ideas and his legacies are sort of to be found in sometimes unexpected places.
That's a really awesome way to finish. So I really appreciate that answer. That's great. I'd again love to thank you and the audience, and especially Mizan as well, for organizing things. And I'd highly recommend anyone who hasn't got the book, get it. In the same way, also get Sheikh Ali Tareen's fabulous Defending Muhammad in Modernity, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so thank you both. Thanks to Sheikh Ali for coming on. But Max, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for spending so much time and such a wonderful explanation for us. So thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. And it's just such a pleasure to speak with you and to meet everyone and to have an opportunity to connect and talk about Shibli. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Max. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Dr. Tareen as well, and all the people who've given the questions. We will be sending the link, but if you're already registered, we'll send you the link to the recording, and we'll also send you the forthcoming sessions as well. So without further ado, thank you, everyone, and have a great evening or morning or lunch, wherever you are in the world. I think we've got viewers from far as West Coast to Indonesia at the moment. Take care. Inshallah, we see you soon. Wassalamu alaikum.
Thanks so much. Take care, Max.
Thank you.
Thanks.